Good afternoon. Welcome to Trib Talk. We're going to recap all the news that was in the 2020 GOP primary, and we're going to touch on the Democratic primary in the 1st District as well. Joining me, we've got Bethany Rodgers and Taylor Stevens. They're political and government reporters for the Salt Lake Tribune and have been all over this race for the last several months. So let's start with the gubernatorial race, and I'll let you guys decide who wants to take this one. But tell us what happened, tell us why it happened, and what we know and what we don't know right
now. Wow. I'll just jump in on that. We were expecting going into Election Day that this would really be a horse race between Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox and former Governor Jon Huntsman. That's what the polling was showing. We'd also heard that there was a possible path to victory for former House Speaker Greg Hughes, but we weren't really sure how his numbers were going to play out. He was he was trailing in most of the polling that I saw. So election night happened, and sure enough, it's pretty much what we thought it would be from the first round of numbers that came out. We saw Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox a little bit ahead. He is about 2 percentage points ahead, or 3 percentage points at this point, I believe. He's got 37% to Jon Huntsman's 34%. And Greg Hughes is some distance behind at about 21%. So he's dropped out, conceded. Thomas Wright, who was the 4th Republican in the primary, has also now conceded, leaving Cox and Huntsman just the 2 people remaining as the ballots continue to be counted in coming days and up to 3 weeks. We should have more answers as to who's the victor, but at this point, it's looking promising for Spencer Cox.
And so up to 3 weeks before we get final numbers, they are going to be releasing numbers this afternoon. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And we just learned from the state elections office yesterday that they have an estimated 112,000 ballots remaining to be counted. That doesn't include the ballots that continue to flow in to the clerk's offices. There could be some in the mail since voters were allowed to postmark them on election day itself. So that total could even increase. But there are a sizable number of ballots that still remain to be counted. It's not clear how many of those 112,000 will be in the Republican primary, but we can assume a lot of them will be.
Yeah.
I think it might be interesting to talk a little bit about how different this race has been from, what we've seen in the past. Obviously, when these candidates entered the race, Utah had a great economy. Everything was looking like it was going to be on the up and up. And then the coronavirus came and an earthquake came, and we all know the impacts that's had. But early on in the campaign, there were in-person debates. Candidates could go door to door. And that was really disrupted with the coronavirus, where candidates had to rely a lot more on virtual forums like the one that we're in now. That was a big shift. This election has also been very different just procedurally because they've had to implement an all-by-mail system. Typically, you're able to go to the polls on Election Day, cast your vote, get your sticker. But it was important to the state that they not facilitate large gatherings of people who are breathing on the same voting equipment, the same pens or pencils. So we had an all-by-mail voting this time around, which was very different. As Bethany mentioned, you could postmark day of, and so that's caused some delays in getting our results. We don't have, I think, as many results as we typically would have at this point had things been run kind of in the usual way. They've also been quarantining ballots for 24 hours just out of an abundance of caution. And so those ballots at this point should all be kind of in the process now, but that also caused some delays. Typically, the canvass is 2 weeks, and they've extended it to 3. So there's a possibility if the race just continues to tighten and get closer, that we won't really know who's won this race until 3 weeks after.
Keep everybody on the edge of their seats. It's a cliffhanger. Bethany, you had something to add?
Oh, no, I completely agree that the coronavirus has really shaped every aspect of this campaign, from the political side of things and how the candidates are able to interact with the public. I mean, Jon Huntsman himself came down with the coronavirus at one point, so that really, affected, I'm sure, his campaign and his plans. And then, as Taylor said, all the way down to the way we're counting the ballots and conducting the election. But I do think it's interesting that it looks like at this point we're on pace for record primary participation despite that. I just spoke with the state's elections director yesterday who said we've already gotten more votes counted in the governor's race than participated in the Senate race in 2018 between Mitt Romney and Mike Kennedy. So I think that really speaks volumes about how familiar Utahns are with vote by mail.
Yeah.
So important this race is to Utahns because their seat hasn't been open for 30 years, 3 decades or so. And I think a lot of people, and I think we can talk about the voter switching, the party switching. A lot of people felt like this race was so important to shaping how the state moves forward, because we know that a Democrat hasn't been in that highest office in the state for some time. And if you wanted to have an influence on this race, a lot of people felt like they needed to switch their affiliation, vote Republican. So that definitely played, I think, into the turnout as well.
Talk a little bit about how many people we think switched, and do we know yet if they showed up at the polls, or is it too soon to tell?
Yeah, so what we know at this point, or at least from my own reporting on this, is that I believe more than 130,000, 140,000 new Republican voters in this year alone. And then there was around 50,000, I think, who registered in about the last month or so statewide. And it's not clear which of those are newly registered voters and which of those are party switches, people who are unaffiliated or Democrats who decided to switch over in order to participate in the primary. I did speak with a representative of the Utah Republican Party earlier this week who said that according to their analysis, it didn't look like there had been very many ballots cast at that point by party switchers. And that was Monday. So it's possible that, their analysis was off, or that that those people were waiting a little bit later in the game to cast their ballot. But at that point, it was only about 12,000 that they were aware of that had actually cast ballots in the primary.
Well, that creates a really interesting dynamic too, right? Because if we think that there a lot of people did switch, but not very many of them cast their ballots, either those people went to the trouble of changing their party affiliation and then ended up not voting, or else they're voting late, and that could really affect what these 112,000 plus ballots that are remaining to be counted look like.
Well, you've been crunching the numbers on that. What do you think we have? Do you think that the ballots that remain to be counted will look really different from the ones that have already been counted?
I was looking at, if you remember 2 years ago, we had the Ben McAdams Mia Love contest that sort of seesawed back and forth for several weeks. And it all came down really to the ballots down the stretch, those that were cast late in the game. And in that race, at least, the ballots that were cast on Election Day and were counted after Election Day tilted decisively more in McAdams' favor. And so it's not necessarily true that the ballots that counted after Election Day are going to look the same as those that are cast before Election Day. I think it's likely that the ballots are going to tip a little bit in Huntsman's favor. 112,000, we don't know how many of them are Democrats. Probably about 30,000 to 40,000 of those, 30,000 of those are probably in the Democratic primary. And so, it's not inconceivable, I think, that Huntsman could find a way to make this, if not really close, maybe potentially take a lead. I think Weber County is going to be one that we need to watch right now because they've got a lot of outstanding ballots. They haven't reported since election night. They're expected to report some today. So this is still very much up in the air, I think. And you'd rather be in Cox's shoes right now because it's always better to have a lead. But we just have to kind of wait and see, I guess. One of them that we don't have to wait and see on, I guess, is the Attorney General's race. It looks like Sean Ray is pulled away in that from David Levitt. Who wants to field that one?
Yeah, I guess I'll just jump in on that. There's been a lot of great reporting in that race by my colleague Lee Davidson. And it was interesting. It seemed to me from reading his coverage that it was really a hard-hitting race between those two, that there was a lot of criticism in both directions on campaign finance, a lot of hearkening back. It seemed like the scandals of the past with David Levitt, the Utah County attorney, basically saying that Sean Reyes, the incumbent, had put a for sale sign on the Attorney General's office, which is something we heard said about John Swallow, who resigned in disgrace. So it was kind of, I don't know, it was definitely a fiery contest, but in the end, it seems as if, Sean Reyes will be able to hold on to his seat. He's leading, I think, 54%, 46% at this point to David Levitt. And so it seems as though David Levitt just wasn't able to get over that line and oust the incumbent.
Yeah, it's always hard to beat an incumbent. Reyes has been in there since I believe 2012, so he's got some tenure in there. The winner of the primary, I guess Sean Reyes, is going to face Greg Skordas, who's the Democratic nominee, sort of a prominent defense attorney who ran for Attorney General once, and so that could be a pretty compelling race, frankly. The last couple candidates that Reyes has beaten were not necessarily, one of them dropped out a few months into the race, so this could be a challenge for Reyes, I think. Speaking of challenges, we've got the 4th district race. I touched a little bit on Ben McAdams and his narrow victory over Mia Love 2 years ago. This year, he's going to apparently go against Burgess Owens. Who wants to tell us what happened in that primary?
Yeah, so there were, I believe, 4 candidates in that race, and Burgess Owens, came out with a really strong lead. He's been declared the winner over the others in that contest pretty quickly on. And as you mentioned, going up against Representative Ben McAdams, that was such a tight race last time around. I think he won by about 800 votes. And several political handicappers think that McAdams' seat could be vulnerable. He is Utah's only Democrat in Congress. And so it'll be a really interesting race. I think one of those to watch after, everything's finalized here going into November. Burgess Owens, former NFL player, he beat out a few candidates who, had some interesting kind of segments during the race. Among them, Kim Coleman, a state representative who she had really kind of connected herself to some of the Trump rhetoric around the coronavirus. Bethany, you reported on some of that, as well as she was one of the attendees of that business revival concert in Cedar City, which I believe was last month, although it moves so strangely these days. But yeah, so she didn't perform too well. Other candidates eventually couldn't hold up to Burgess Owens. And, how much of that has to do with name recognition. As someone who doesn't watch football, I'm not sure, but it's definitely, he went up against some others with some political clout, and they ultimately couldn't kind of meet up to that level.
Yeah, I was a little surprised that Owens won so easily, frankly. I mean, Kim Coleman had got several prominent endorsements from the Freedom Caucus, which is the ultra-conservative wing of the House Republican, the National Republican Party. But
he's also endorsed by Mia Love.
Yeah. Which let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, if correct me if I'm wrong, but Burgess Owens and Kim Coleman are both considerably more conservative than Mia Love. How does that play into the race going forward with Ben McAdams, trying to defend his seat for the first time?
I think it'll be interesting to see, because we know that this is a district that does like moderates in some way. Obviously, voting for McAdams, I think, was influenced by the medical marijuana and some of the other ballot initiatives in 2018. Younger voters, first-time voters getting out. I was at the polls in 2018 talking to people and just, talked to so many people who'd never voted before but felt really strongly about some of those ballot initiatives. So turnout in that race definitely helped him. But we know that, people in this district are willing to support more moderate candidates. So it will be interesting to see if a very conservative can capture, somebody who's very conservative can capture the attention and the imagination of voters enough to get them to turn out in November.
Just to jump in real quick on that point, I think that it was kind of interesting, this race. It felt a little bit like there was a search for a viable moderate candidate on the Republican side early on in the primary. And it just never seemed to come together for whatever reason. State Senator Dan Hummert was, an early candidate, an early hopeful, but it ended up pulling out of the race because he said he was preoccupied with, his personal business. And so it felt like it left a little bit of a vacuum in the primary.
Yeah, I would say Jay McFarland, J-Mac, the former talk radio host, maybe was trying to fill that niche. He was the only candidate in a recent debate who said he was wearing a mask in public. I believe his daughter has asthma, and he talked about, the importance of protecting everyone from the coronavirus. The others have kind of staked out a claim more of kind of personal liberty and not needing to wear those face masks. So I feel like he was maybe trying to fill that niche a little bit. Another, candidate with some good name recognition, but ultimately we saw Burgess Owens come out pretty strong in that primary contest.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun race to watch. I think, Taylor, you mentioned one of the top races in the nation. It's going to draw a lot of money from the National Party, and I think it's going to be pretty hotly contested. People I've talked to think that Ben McAdams is going to have an easy time with Burgess Owens, and I'm not so sure. As you mentioned, Ben had all these tailwinds at his back last time with the initiatives, with low Republican turnout, frankly, and still just barely pulled it out. And so, in a presidential year, the electorate looks very different. And so I think it's going to be a really interesting race to watch. Let's turn to the first district. We had a Republican primary up there. This is the race to replace Representative Rob Bishop. We had both a Republican and a Democratic primary up there. And we saw Blake Moore, who appears to be holding on to a lead. Who wants to address where we stand on that?
Yeah, I think he has about an 800 vote lead last time I checked. So it's a pretty close race between Blake Moore and Bob Stevenson, I believe, the Davis County Commissioner. So it's a close race, definitely one that we might have to wait again for that 3 weeks for that canvass. But yeah, one interesting thing, Moore, he doesn't live in the district. And so that's been, a bit of a point of contention always in a congressional race where you have someone who is not in the district that they're trying to represent. But this is a big race for this northern Utah district, as you mentioned, been represented by Rob Bishop for a long time, I think 18 years. And before that, had a representative who was in for a long stint. So this is the chance to get some new blood in that race. So we'll see how it comes down between those two candidates in the end. Also, worth mentioning, Katie Witt drew a lot of attention in this election cycle. She's the Kaysville mayor. She was censured by the Kaysville City Council for trying to hold the business revival concert in her city. Ultimately, as we've mentioned, that ended up in Cedar City, and she attended that. But she didn't have a great showing for, how much she was kind of putting herself out there, how much she was in the news. She didn't have a great showing on election night. So it's interesting to see, both her and Kim Coleman, I think, kind of were striking some similar tones, and it didn't seem that it really connected with voters.
And I think that is reflected in the governor's race too. I think that's one of the most interesting trends of this. You had Greg Hughes, who was the most loyal Trump supporter, losing to two guys who were, expressed support for Trump, but not nearly with the same passion, I would say, that Greg Hughes did. And so it kind of, as I wrote in my column today, it's a little bit of a temperature reading for the state of the Republican Party and the state of the electorate in Utah. I think that, while they profess support for Trump, 82% among Republicans say they support the president. It's not that much of a trigger, I guess. It's not something that's going to drive people to the polls the way that some might have thought it would. Taylor, can you just touch on briefly the Democratic primary in the first district?
Yes, we had Darren Perry, who is the chairman of the Shoshone Northwest Band, the Northwest Band of Shoshone Nation, and Jamie Cheek. Darren Perry was leading as of the last time I looked at the numbers. And I believe he's a little bit more moderate, and that Jamie Cheek is a little bit more progressive as far as, what we've found in our reporting. But yeah, that'll be interesting to see how that one plays out. Again, we might not know for a little while who the winners in those contests in the first district are. So there's just no clear, path right now.
Yeah, and I think we're still waiting. As I mentioned, Weber County hasn't updated its numbers. It's a populous area. Davis County still has about 15,000 ballots out. So those we'll have to see when those come in and see how that changes the shape of the race. We got a couple questions here online. Riley wants to know if we've heard about any voter fraud issues in this election. This is kind of a big issue hanging over elections generally this year, because a lot of states are going to vote by mail. Utah's been doing vote by mail for a number of years. President Trump has obviously raised questions, said it's rife with fraud, and raised questions about the validity of the election. Do we know anything about the instances of voter fraud this election yet?
I haven't heard anything about voter fraud at this point in time, but that does make me think about a story that I wrote last year. It was after I had spent some time with Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox in his campaign bus, and he mentioned while we were on the road that in his role as head of the state's elections office, that he's noticed that Utah's main voter fraud problem is really just with missionary moms who mail in ballots for their children while they're away, that maybe, just want to make sure that their kid doesn't miss out on the opportunity to weigh in on an election. And so he said that the incidence of cases in which there's someone with, a criminal intent who's like going in and misrepresenting their identity, at a polling place, or, voting on behalf of a dead person, it very, very rarely happens. And I don't think the people that I talked to for that story, I don't think the clerks remembered any prosecutions in their time in office. So I would be surprised if there were, criminal prosecutions for voter fraud this time around as well.
Yeah, I think if there is fraud, it's probably going to take a little while to come out in this election. There are a lot of safeguards in place, as Bethany, you've written about this before. They check the signatures against the signature they have on file. If the signatures don't match, they contact the people. There have been in other states, I believe about 2 years ago in a congressional race, there was a ballot harvesting scam that ended up getting, they caught the guy, he was convicted for it, they had to redo the election. But generally speaking, when you're trying to steal ballots in a mail-in race, you can do ballot harvesting, that's illegal, but if you're trying to steal ballots, it's a very high risk, low reward proposition. You're risking getting caught, for one thing, to get a handful of votes that probably aren't going to make all that much difference. So, the literature on this is that there's not much voter fraud. You remember the president had a panel that was looking at voter fraud, generally speaking, not just on mail-in elections. Voter fraud, generally speaking, regardless what system you're using, is there's a very low incidence of it. So we're going to take a question here from John, who said, what do you make of the numerous county officials who got bounced and some incumbent state lawmakers who didn't make it through the primary either? What does this say about the power of incumbency this year?
Yeah, I reported on this yesterday. We saw several state lawmakers, as you mentioned, who were either had been ousted or were in a tight spot. My reporting on that has shown that was very tied to the tax reform proposal. There was, Senator Lyle Hilliard. He is the longest serving state senator. I believe he's been in the Senate since 1985, and he entered the legislature in 1981, switched over to the Senate. But he was the leader, the sponsor of the tax reform effort that was so unpopular and was ultimately overturned amid the citizens' referendum. So in a lot of ways, there were many candidates, inter-party challengers, who were making an issue of tax reform in those races. Some of them, appear to have trampled their opponents or at least have a bit of an edge. Some of the races, it hasn't made a huge difference. And so I think in Lyle Hilliard's case, he said himself that, maybe people are just ready for a change, that he's been in there for a long time and it's time for some fresh blood in there. But definitely tax reform played out in many of these legislative races and hurt some incumbents, I think, as far as the showing, the reason for people to get out and vote against a lawmaker who had supported a food tax. That was a big incentive for voters to get out this time around.
Yeah, I believe Val Potter lost up in northern Utah, and down in southern Utah, Brad Last is barely holding off Willie Billings right now. There are a couple races that we're still going to have to watch and see how they play out. I haven't followed the county races as closely. I don't know if you guys have paid attention to those, or
I saw Nathan Ivey got voted out.
Yes.
And we had a story about that, and he really felt like his coming out as being gay really hurt him. His opponent says he thinks it has more to do with tax increase passed in Utah County, but yeah, I think that was a major upset.
Yeah, and I know Taylor referenced the ballot referendum to try to get the tax reform bill taken off. I know Fred Cox, former state representative, apparently it looks like he's going to lose to Dave Albert, and former West Jordan mayor, for a county council seat here in Salt Lake County. So here's a good question: did everyone at the Trib vote for Huntsman? I think we're probably going to politely decline to answer that, but I will say it's been I can say from on behalf of the Trib, I think it's been a challenge to try to cover a race where the brother of the candidate, Paul Huntsman, is the chairman of the board of our paper. I know you guys have done your level best to try to be impartial on this, but there is a perception out there that we're somehow influenced one way or another by the candidacy. I will say, and you guys can comment on this if you want, that I have never had any influence from the Huntsman family or from Paul Huntsman or from John Huntsman to write anything or not write anything in regards to this race. But it has been a challenge. If you write something that's potentially critical to one of the candidates, it's seen as the Huntsman mouthpiece. If you don't write something that's critical, you're seen as being in the bag. So it's been a challenging race to cover, but I think to Bethany and Taylor's credit, they've done their level best to do it in the fairest and most objective fashion they can. You guys have anything to add on that one?
I think some of the candidates used the ownership issue to, try to play to their advantage, to say, that if we had a negative story about them, that we were pushing for, Huntsman. So I think some of them saw a strategic advantage in pointing out our ownership. We're very upfront and transparent about our ownership. We list that on every story that we write about anyone in the Huntsman family, that our owner is Paul Huntsman. And as much as, I think people are skeptical, I speak to Paul Huntsman once a year at the Christmas party, and I don't hear from him any other time. So I would say that we are aware of our ownership, and we do our best to be transparent about it, but I wouldn't say that it's had any influence in our reporting on the race.
And I would add that while not going into anybody's voting personal decision on any races, that I've never been pressured as to my vote in any way, shape, or form, one way or the other. So just want to pitch that in and answer the question.
All right. Take that for what it's worth. We're pivoting, just looking ahead in the couple minutes we've got left right now. As we kind of put these primaries behind us, what do you guys see in the months ahead? Is COVID still going to be an overarching issue? Is it still going to be impeding the way the candidates campaign? Or do you think that people have kind of moved past that and we'll see a more traditional campaign for governor? We've got Chris Peterson, who's running as the Democrat, and for governor, and then we've got these other races, the Burgess Owens, Ben McAdams one we talked about. What's it going to look like between now and November?
I think as far as the governor race goes, I mean, I definitely got the sense, this sort of sigh of relief sense from a lot of from the gubernatorial candidates. A Democrat hasn't won the governor's seat in Utah in decades, and so I think that for many people, the primary was really the deciding election for the governor's race. I expect to see that race kind of slow down a little bit from here on out. I do think that the candidates have sort of figured out how to campaign in the era of COVID. There was a KU TV debate recently where the candidates were able to debate in the same studio. They maintained social distancing, and there was no live audience there. So I think that, we've figured out ways to host events like that, compare candidates. You see some people going back out onto the campaign trail again and, hosting socially distant town halls and that sort of thing. So I think that we'll see that going forward.
Yeah, I think that will depend on our cases too. Like, do we continue to see spikes? Do we have to implement more shutdowns? Do we have to, be more careful? We did see the last weeks of the governor's race, as Bethany mentioned, candidates did begin to feel more comfortable going out on the campaign trail, talking to voters in person, even shaking hands. Whether that will be able to continue if we continue to see an increase in our cases, I'm not sure what the fall is going to look like. There are some people who are anticipating kind of a second spike. I think we're still in our first spike based on the data that we're seeing. So that will really depend. But I think Bethany's right that the coronavirus will continue to shape all of these conversations because we're in a very different place than we were in January, just as far as the economy goes, as far as our culture goes. This has impacted so many slices of life that it's impossible to not continue to shape these races and how voters are thinking about these candidates.
Okay. We are out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. If you enjoyed the Trib Talk, check out all the coverage, the great coverage that Taylor and Bethany and Lee Davidson and the rest of the team have done on the political campaigns. They'll be out on the trail between now and November, covering every turn and twist of the adventure. Follow us at sltrib.com. You can follow us on Twitter. And subscribe to the Tribune if you value the coverage that you're seeing here. So, but thank you guys. Thank you for your time, and thank you for joining us. And we'll see you next time on Trib Talk.